Today's lesson, we're going to be looking at the population growth and the population decline. This is a two-part lesson, and this is the first part of this two-part lesson. So your essential question will be carried over into the next section as well. Question is, why should we look at population trends? And then what can we predict from the population trends? I'm going to do this a little bit out of order. We're going to look at the historical trends and the projections of the future trends first, to kind of give you an idea of what we're looking at, and then we're going to go and look at how we actually look at it. So your first section, historical trends and projections. One thing we need to understand is the RNI. Sometimes it's referred to as the NIR. It's the rate of natural increase or the natural increase rate. This is how far the population is increasing or decreasing even. It's much lower in the 21st century than it was in the 20th century, so that rate is actually shrinking. In the 21st century, the rate of natural increase is 1.2%, and with that figure at 2010, we should have reached 7 billion. It was a little bit later, and then by 2050, it should have been 9.5 billion. So that's kind of the projection of where we're looking. The rate of natural increase relies totally on fertility and the total fertility rate of how many babies, women who are in the childbearing age, how many babies they are having, and that gives you total fertility rate, which will then plug into the rate of natural increase, and we can see how the population is increasing throughout these time periods. I've got two examples that I'm going to look at here. Both of these examples have a very high population. One of those has a high population or a high rate of natural increase. The other one has a low rate of natural increase. The high rate of natural increase was in India. In 1976, all birth control efforts failed within India. The Indian government tried to push birth control and push limiting the amount of babies being born, and by 1976, this framework fell apart. Now the government relies totally on education of the public and as well as advertisement to kind of have fewer children. The only effort that reaches success is sterilization of women once they have a couple of kids. And that's all the government can do that's been effective, is to sterilize women so that the population does not increase anymore. China is another example. When you think of China, you probably think of this place with a huge population. You'd be correct. But the rate of natural increase is actually kind of low in China rather than how it's been in recent years. Since 2000, their rate of natural increase is actually lower than the United States. Maybe hard to believe. This goes back to the one-child policy. The government put forth this policy so that the population would be skewed, so that it would be dropped down. In today's society, you can have another child. There's a family planning fee that you have to pay to have this other child. So what that does is that puts the families who have money having 2 or more kids, and the families who can't afford it only having 1. So your population that is growing is your higher end population and not your lower end population. Now, the next thing is kind of the bulk of the lesson for today, and this is the sheet that I gave you. You should have this in front of you. This is the demographic transition model. What the demographic transition model does is it explains the transition from a high birth rate to a high death rate, and also from a low birth rate to a low death rate, and maybe vice versa, depending on different categories, as a country develops. So as a country is developing, we're looking at the transition that the demographics are going through. In stage 1 of that transition, you have a very low population growth. You have a very high birth rates, but also very high death rates, which keeps the population low. So a lot of people are dying and a lot of people are being born, so that population stays steady. Most of human history is here. A lot of the hunter-gatherers time period before society was actually civilized, where we sat down and created cities, this is what was going on. Next, you have stage 2, which is a high population growth. During this stage, you have a rapidly declining death rate, and you still have the high birth rate. So your death rate's decreasing, your birth rate is still increasing, so you have population growth, which is what's going on in the middle of those two lines. Europe and North America are here after the Industrial Revolution. Once we hit that point, we're able to move forward. The lower developed parts of Africa, Asia, and Latin America are here because of the medical revolution. Stage 3 is the moderate population growth. It's not a high population growth, it's not a population decrease. but it's a moderate population growth, kind of in the middle. Birth rates are declining, they're rapidly declining, but then death rates also continue their decline. So instead of this sharp increase in birth rates and decrease in death rates, you still have the decrease in death rates, but your birth rates are also declining, which creates that middle portion, which is a moderate population growth. This is when people decide to have fewer children. The key word there is decide. This is when nations and governments set forth and they say, okay, from here on out, we need to have lower kids because it's better. The more developed countries of Asia and Latin America are here. This is the kind of shift you have when societies are focused on farming. We're here because you want to have a lot of kids so you can have a lot of farmers. Then after that point, once you get industrialized, you no longer need a lot of kids to farm because you're working other types of higher skilled jobs. And so that need for a higher population is not there. So you can see the development scale coming. Less developed, newly industrialized, more developed. We move on to stage 4, which is a low population growth. Very low birth rates as well as very low death rates that produce low population growth or a zero population growth, meaning population is not growing at all. Social customs have to come into play with this. Again, kind of going back to the government decisions. It needs to set forth that society's social patterns need to be in place where you don't need to have a lot of kids and you don't have to have that for power in that society. There's a lot of countries here. These are your more developed countries, such as Denmark, the United States. Most of Western Europe is here in the low population growth. And then you have stage 5. This is when the population is declining. This means you have a high population. You have a high population still. It's not that you have a low population. You have a high population, but your crude birth rates and your crude death rates are very low, so you're not increasing. A lot of times, the only increase in population you have here is by immigration, where people are moving in, and they're not put into this formula of population of the demographic transition. This is where you have a big portion of population in the aging. Your population pyramid is huge here, so your death rate is high, not because you can't control it, but because you have a big portion of your population in the elderly, and then they're dying off, and it's going there. Germany is the best example of a country here. Next, we're moving on to Thomas Malthus's theory. He has a theory on world population, and he says that world population increase is far outrunning the food production. He came up with this theory in 1798, in England. He says that there needs to be moral restraint, that morals need to be set forth that say we don't need to have more kids. Okay, either that, or he said famine has to occur, disease has to occur, wars need to occur, some of these things that could, maybe natural disasters need to occur to inflict a higher crude death rate. We either need to have moral restraint to have a lower crude birth rate, or we need to have these things put into place to have a higher crude death rate so that this won't happen. This is his projection. Okay, this is in 2000. By 2025, by 2050, the population is going to start to outgrow the resources. By 2100, the resources are going to steadily be here, and the population is going to be way up here in the billions, in the 14 billion range. That was Thomas Malthus's theory. In theory, it sounds scary because you've got the idea that population is growing and food production is not growing. So this population is going to outgrow the food production. So what are we going to do to live? Which will move us on in just a little bit. We'll answer that question. Neo-Malthusians, aka what I'm referring to now is more modern Malthusians, what they do is they add to the paranoia. They add two things that they said Thomas Malthus did not incorporate these two things, which makes it worse than what he said. Number one, they say Malthus didn't take into effect that the poorest countries are going to be the ones that have the highest population, so the disparity between population growth and production, food production, is going to be even higher because it's not your more developed nations that are having a higher population, it's your less developed nations, which is a true statement. The other point they made is that they said not only is the food resources being outstripped, but because of this population growth, other resources as well that can help improve lives are being outstripped. The next thing we have, next section is the critics of Malthus. The people who, they put 4 points into place that said Malthus isn't correct because of these things. First off, they said, Thomas Malthus says that resources are fixed, that on Earth's surface there's only so many resources, only so much food production. But that's not the case. Resources, or mainly food production and food resources, are expanding with the population. Next thing he says is that that Malthus does not take into account that more people could also mean more food production. That as a population increased, it would stimulate the economy, more people would be working, and so more people would be farming, in essence, because of that. The third thing is he says that the world's that Malthus leaves out, that the world's population and the resources have steadily stayed at the same rate. That food production has grown the same with population all throughout history, so why can't that happen anymore? Last thing that the critics of Thomas Malthus say is that population has not grown at the rate that Malthus projected, and like we said with a rate of natural increase, it has actually shrank in the last century. So you see this massive formula here? It's not important that you understand the specifics of the formula. Next thing we're going to look at is the demographic accounting equation. The demographic accounting equation is how geographers use, or it's what geographers use to determine how much a population will grow. They plug in all of these statistics into the figure, and that gives you how much the population will grow. This is what's important you understand, not so much this. Last slide. That's all, folks.